One of the most infamous and most historic moments of the past 30 years saw the dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, fall from power. An American-led coalition stormed into the nation to destabilise the dictatorship and the government, and Saddam would later be captured, and he was brought to trial and then executed. The courts heard of his genocidal actions and his crimes, but also brought to trial were many members of his government and former allies who were also involved in the evils of the Iraqi dictatorship and regime. One man who was executed in 2007, shortly after Saddam's own execution, was Taha Yassin Ramadan, a long-serving member of the Iraqi military, and a man who served as one of 3 vice presidents inside of the nation. He served from 1991 until the fall of Saddam, and was also the commander of the Popular Army. But he too went to the gallows for his crimes. In this video we look at the execution of Saddam's vice president. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Taha Yassin Ramadan al-Jazvari was born in 1938 inside of Mosul, and he followed a very similar path to many men of the time. He attended military college, and he then served inside of the army for many years. He retired from service in 1959, but then went back to the military, but he was then placed under house arrest. He then, following his release, became an elected member to the regional leadership of the Iraqi Ba'ath Party. But following the 17th of July revolution, he was once again reinstated inside the army, and he became a member of the Revolutionary Command Council. Taha Ramadan was rising throughout different circles inside of Iraq, and in 1970 he was in charge of a special court that tried enemies of the revolution, and he was appointed the Minister of Industry and later Minister of Housing. During his court proceeding, he ordered the summary execution of 42 people who were accused of plotting to overthrow the government. He would later also threaten to mutilate anyone who was later investigating human rights abuses inside of Saddam's dictatorship. Ramadan transformed the Ba'ath Party from a small group to a 1 million strong organisation, and his key idea was to identify Saddam Hussein as the future leader of the nation of Iraq. They were 2 of the few survivors of the 1968 coup. Ramadan was also the commander of the Iraqi Popular Army, a militia associated with his political party, and he held many different positions. But on the 16th of July 1979, following Saddam's rise to power as the President of Iraq, Taha Ramadan was appointed the first Deputy Prime Minister. In this position he oversaw the many different ministries inside of the nation and the state projects, and he was also involved as a diplomat, going to many different countries and nations to visit and meet with important world leaders. However, shortly after Saddam seized power, Ramadan managed a terrible meeting in which he denounced a Syrian plot, and members of the Revolutionary Command Council were forced to confess to being involved in a coup against Saddam, and they were then immediately shot. He rose through very brutal measures, and initially he was very powerful, but he would soon become overshadowed by Saddam Hussein. Ramadan later demanded the assassination of many foreign leaders, and as tensions ramped up between America and Iraq, Ramadan suggested that the American President George Bush and Saddam Hussein should settle their differences and opinions in a duel. He was a very strange man, and he thought that the idea would be an alternative to war, and he thought that this would not then cripple Iraq. He knew that his country was weak when compared to a nation like the Americans, and Ramadan also proposed that a group of American government officials should face off with the Iraqi government officials in duels, and then the winner of most of them would then be victorious, and he even proposed that the UN Secretary General of the time, Kofi Annan, should almost act as a referee. But let's remember that Taha Ramadan was a very brutal man. He had called upon people to become human bombs, suicide bombers who would cause chaos throughout the ranks, and he headed up a mafia-style crime syndicate that controlled imports from different nations. But following the invasion of Iraq by the US-led coalition, Ramadan's career came to a sharp halt. 2 days after the invasion, his villa was hit and targeted by US missiles and destroyed, and that very day He had spoken out against the Americans, and he predicted that the Americans would suffer the biggest loss of human life in their history. But following the fall of Baghdad, Ramadan was named on the Americans' most wanted list, and he featured on the pack of cards which were given to US soldiers for them to identify high-value targets with. In fact, Ramadan was the 10 of diamonds. He was captured in August 2003 inside of Mosul by fighters of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, who then handed him over to the Americans. He was interrogated by the US forces for information, specifically as to where Saddam Hussein was, and intelligence about war crimes and crimes against humanity conducted by the regime. Saddam was months later captured, and in 2005 they were both placed on trial for their genocidal campaigns. Ramadan was tried in the Iraq Special Tribunal's al-Dujal trial, and the courtroom heard of Ramadan's involvement in the 1982 massacre of 148 men and boys in the Shia city of Dujal. Initially, to begin with, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, but the prosecution appealed against his sentence, deeming it far too lenient, and this was then converted to a death sentence, meaning that Ramadan was then scheduled to be executed. Before dawn on the 20th of March 2007, the 4th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq, Taha Yassin Ramadan was led into the execution chamber, where he came face to face with the gallows. He was led up the steps of the structure by an executioner and prison guards, and the executioner allowed the death sentence then to be read out. Prayers were said before the executioner then secured the noose around his neck, and he also placed a black cap over Ramadan's head. There were witnesses in the execution chamber, and then Ramadan was shuffled over the trapdoor of the gallows. The executioner, when instructed, then pushed the lever, releasing it, and Ramadan was sent crashing through the execution structure to his death. Following the fall of Iraq, there were many of Saddam's key allies who were dragged in front of a courtroom to face up to the crimes that their regime and they had committed. Ramadan's crimes had been going on for years, and he was an important cog in the rise of the dictator and in keeping Saddam Hussein in power for so long. He was a strange man, someone who requested that the President of the United States face Saddam Hussein in a duel, presumably to the death, to see who was right or to prevent a larger conflict. He was, like a number of war criminals, brought to the gallows for his crimes, and he was executed inside his homelands of Iraq. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.